Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fourth all-staff briefing about the process surrounding COP26 and the university's sustainability strategy. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Caroline Knowles. I'm head of the research communications team, and I'm chairing today's session because Dominic Zaum, who was going to chair it, is ill, unfortunately, so he couldn't be with us. That doesn't really matter because we've got two fantastic speakers today. We've got with us Bill Collins, who's Professor of Climate Science in the Meteorology Department, and he was one of the authors of the IPCC report which fed into the COP processes and all the discussions, and which you'll have seen a lot on the media. And then we've also got Tim Dixon, who's Professor of the Built Environment, and he has been working a lot on sustainability of the built environment and does a lot of work in the local area with the town and with various lobby groups about climate change in the town. So we've got a good discussion today. We're going to look at COP26 and what's coming out of the summit, although it's not quite finished yet, of course. So Bill's going to reflect on that, and then discussion about climate adaptation in the local area. So, like I said, this is the last of 4 talks that we've held over the last 2 weeks. The 3 other presentations are all available on the staff portal if you'd like to see them, with videos of the presentations and the questions which were asked. We've had very lively discussions about all the presentations so far, and I hope that we'll have good discussions today as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to just introduce very quickly Bill Collins. Bill is Professor of Climate Processes in the Department of Meteorology, working on the climate impacts of short-lived climate pollutants and the impact of climate change on air quality. He was one of the authors of the IPCC report, as I said, and we're delighted he'll join us today to reflect on the outcomes of COP, even though it's not quite over yet. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Bill to start his presentation about COP.
Thank you, Caroline. So I'm going to talk about what has come out of COP, but before I go into that, I will also go into a little bit of climate science, because I feel that's important in order to understand what the results of COP imply. A report came out this summer from the IPCC, which Nigel explained in the first of these talks that 6 of us from Reading contributed to. And behind this, of course, is not just the 6 people who contributed to the report, but decades of work that have come from the Department of Meteorology here at Reading, and also the National Centre for Atmospheric Sciences in Reading. So there's a lot of Reading contributions to this report. And I'm just going to mention, because Nigel was talking about what the science can tell us and the science is settled, so you might have remembered that a month or so ago the Nobel Prize was awarded for physics to 2 climate scientists, and in particular in 1967, so that's over 50 years ago, these climate scientists calculated the warming you would get from doubling the CO2. So from absolutely that point of view, the science was settled 50 years ago. People think, oh, it's something quite modern to understand the effect of carbon dioxide on climate. Really, we had some pretty good ideas over 50 years ago. So that's not what the latest science has been investigating, whether climate change is real or not. It's really been investigating how much climate change will happen in future. And so this is a particularly important graph from this report. The details of it I want you to take in is that the warming we get from carbon dioxide depends on the total amount emitted. And that's really just the key point to take away. So we look at this green line here. Every tonne of carbon dioxide we emit takes us further up this graph and warms the climate further. And we can't take that back. So if we drive to work and emit CO2, that's gone into the atmosphere, that's caused some warming, and that's to some extent irreversible. We just end up going up this graph. So I think that's important to take into account. And we can actually use this to work out if we're only going to have an extra warming to take us up to 1.5 degrees, what that means in terms of the amount of carbon we can emit. And it also means we carry on going up this green line until we stop emitting carbon. That's the only way to stop going up this green line, to stop emitting carbon, or possibly to remove CO2 from the atmosphere physically. And that's something I'll mention briefly as well. But this is why net zero is so important. only way to stop warming climate is to actually have zero emissions of CO2. So it's not, oh, well, we'll reduce it by 30%, by 40%, 50%. The key thing that needed to come out of COP was pledges actually to reach zero, which means we stop going up that green line. So this is a graph of possible CO2 scenarios that came out from this IPCC this summer. And the blue line is the one that satisfies the 1.5 degree target, but the one we're more or less on at the moment is the orange line. And what I just showed you in the previous slide was it's the total that matters. So it's the area under this graph. So here for the blue line, the area under this graph has got to be less than the amount of carbon allowed, about 500 billion tonnes. Now, I said we're currently on the orange line, and if we carry on the orange line, then by about 2030, we're getting close to have used up all this budget that we're allowed. So the area under this graph by 2030 is already getting too large. So this is why there's been this focus on 2030 targets, and these, as well as obviously we need to reach net zero to stop going up the green line, but we also need to really achieve much more drastic cuts by 2030 so that we don't increase this area too much. So 2030 targets matter as much as net zero, and I'll come on to that when we get back to COP. And the other thing to mention is if we're going to achieve these really low emissions, then developed countries are going to have to achieve it earlier, because we know that less developed countries are going to struggle to do it. So that's, again, an issue that's come up at COP. And these net zero targets all assume we're going to be able to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which some people have some doubts about. But I'm going to, on this slide, I'm just going to give a positive note. I've been talking about the lower end of this graph. Actually, the IPCC graph looks like this, and these came from scenarios that were proposed in about 2014 or so. So the fact that we're not even now considering these very high graphs, that probably we're on range for somewhere in these bottom three, is actually been a real improvement in our the optimistic move towards solving climate change, even since these scenarios were designed. So we're actually, the fact that we're talking about the lower end of this graph is progress in itself. I'm going to for a couple of seconds mention methane. Methane has a different effect on climate. Instead of being the total emission, it's the rate of emission. So when we hear from Joe Biden and so on that they're going to cut methane by 30%, actually that gives us a chance to move down the green line a bit. Actually cutting methane emissions will move us down a green line rather than for CO2, whereas it just stops us moving up so quickly. So I'll briefly talk about methane when we come on to what COP has decided. The other thing I'm just going to briefly mention is these, they call them NDCs, which are basically the pledges. And these pledges can be conditional, i.e., unconditional, but developing countries have often put in conditional pledges. And this means that they will make this pledge only if they get financial help from developed countries to make those extra to cut. So that'll become important when we talk about what COP achieved. So what did COP achieve? How did it do? Well, there was good news actually last week. We thought we could limit warming to 1.8 degrees. So everyone was shouting, hooray, we're well on track to getting to the 1 degree limit. But then a few days later, it all went to doom and gloom. We're now on course for disastrous heating. Well, how come the opinion changed in just a couple of days? Well, effectively, they're all based on the same data. So they're all saying the same thing, but just picking different points of it. So I mentioned this idea that lots of developing countries make their targets conditional on other things happening. So this is here a graph of the future emissions of greenhouse gases. And based on what countries have put into law, their policies and their action plans, we're actually on track for more like 2.7 degrees of warming. However, the 2030 targets that were announced at COP have brought that down already by about 0.3 of a degree. And then longer term pledges, so these idea of net zero, so not and these net zero targets are actually a lot more stricter than the 2030 targets, maybe because people think, well, by the time I reach net zero, I won't be in power, it'll be somebody else, who knows. But anyway, they are stricter than the 2030 target, so that's brought us down a bit further too. So the 2.4 degree headline was just including the 2030 targets. We can get a bit better than that if we believe people will make their longer term targets. And then there's this optimistic scenario, which is where we assume that all the countries that have said they will do this, if they get the finance, make the ambitious targets that they say they will. So depending whether you think it's doom and gloom or we're doing well, depends on how optimistic you are on which of these pledges you think will be carried out. But one thing to notice is all these pledges are way off by 2030. And I mentioned this idea of this orange area getting too big. If we carry on any of these these higher lines, by 2030 we're already way on our way to missing 1.5 degrees. And so this is why we've got this crucial need to improve the 2030 ambition, not just these long-term goals of net zero. So we can put these, so I gave you the sort of the headline temperature predictions from these, and these are actually what happens if you put those emissions into a simple climate model. So before COP, this model predicted about 2.1 degree of temperature rise, and afterwards this was the headline of 1.8 degrees. You should notice that there's a big range. So 1.8 is just like the middle. Oh, well, if we're just sort of go down the average of all these, then it might be 1.8, but that still doesn't rule out the chance of it being more like 2.6, or perhaps if we're lucky, it's going to be more like 1.4. So again, I want you to bear in mind that when you hear all these things, oh, it'll be whatever numbers of degrees, there's actually a huge range associated with those. And if we want to be sure of not exceeding, for instance, not exceeding 2 degrees, then we're still not, 1.8 might be lying below 2 degrees, but we're still not certain to stay below 2 degrees in any sense. So what needs to happen next? I said we're not really on track for 2030, and in fact we're on track to burn through this allowance by about 2030, this orange area that I showed earlier. So we actually need more stronger action this decade, and my sort of opinion would be that this is where the attention needs to be diverted to, is what happens over the next 9 years between 2021 and 2030. So it's good we've got the long-term net zeros, there's essential, but it's really this decade where the action has to be much, much stronger than has been proposed so far. There was late news yesterday from the United States and Canada, China, who have got these plans now to up their ambitions over the next 10 years. So hopefully that would, if that's realised, and I hope it will, that will work into strong or lower temperatures in these projections. So possibly that's really what we need to get anywhere near 1.5, is the US and China to really cut things immediately the next few years, not the next few decades. There's some draft text of what the conclusions from COP is. I'm just going to highlight a few of them. Climate finance for adaptation is insufficient. We need to reduce global carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030. So this is this big 2030 number I keep telling about. And they regret that we're not going to, or not this target of $100 billion US in finance to the developed nations has not been met. And I said that's absolutely crucial for getting emissions down in the short term, this 2030 target. So what needs to be done? Well, this is what the UK is doing, and the whole world really needs to do this. We need to transition away from using fossil fuels to make power. That just has to stop. And once we've got fossil-free power, then we can electrify our heating and our transport, increase forest cover, and so on. The UK has often comes into stick from its own citizens, but actually it's got by far the strongest targets of any other country. Whether that says something about the UK or says something about the unambitions of the other countries, I'll leave that for you. But the UK does have at least have a plan, and it's the most forward-looking plan of anyone so far. So that's the end of what I had to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. That was really, really interesting. In particular, for me, to understand the importance of the 2030 target was really, really helpful. And I'm sure we'll come back to that again in the discussion later. So now I'm going to introduce Tim Dixon, who's the Professor of Sustainable Futures in the Built Environment, with a particular focus on urban futures and social sustainability. And he's currently working particularly on smart cities and big data, and on social sustainability for house builders. So really important when we think about electrification, we need to think about going forward. Tim's played a really important role, as I said already, at the local level, leading the university's input into the Reading 2050 Smart and Sustainable City Vision. And he also co-chairs the Reading Climate Change Partnership, which the university supports, along with the Borough Council and other major local organisations. So Tim's going to give us a presentation about what's happening here in Reading, and how we can all make a difference and help support local activity in order to feed into national action as well. So I'm going to hand straight over to Tim. Thanks.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Caroline, for that introduction, and it's great to be here today. And thank you also to Bill for giving us such a detailed and insightful overview of the international picture from COP. I wanted to kind of drill down a bit more into the local level, as Caroline's already alluded to, and to kind of take us back a little bit in history almost, because I think even though what we're finding from COP today over the last 10 days is really important, it's important in a local context to look at the previous IPCC report in 2018, which made such a big play of the 1.5 degree limit, because it's really important that we do adhere to that limit as far as we can do. And of course, that really provided the momentum for a lot of local authority action, not only in the UK, but around the globe. It was really a case of climate activists actually promulgating this big change that people really thought was necessary to be able to arrest climate change and deal with carbon emissions. And it was a case of acting on the evidence and making sure that the evidence was scientifically based. I think we've overcome that debate, haven't we, between climate skeptics and the science and the evidence. And now pretty much everybody, with the exception of some people, clearly agree that the evidence for climate change is overwhelming. So in many respects, the argument has been won. But I think what COP shows us, as Bill has already said, is that the new 2050, if you like, is 2030. It's over the next 9 years that we really need to make a difference. And so as a result, actually, of COP23 and the 2018 report, we saw a huge wave of climate emergency declarations from around the world, from North America through to Europe, through to Latin America, through to Australia, and of course in the UK and Europe as well. And one of the first cities to go down that route was actually Bristol, which is my home city where I was born and bred, and that was back in 2018, and other more local authorities followed suit. And you can see here from this slide the really important role that Extinction Rebellion and the climate activist movement played in persuading local authorities that that was the right thing to do, to declare these climate emergencies. And here closer to home in what we might call Berkshire, the Thames Valley region, pretty much all the local authorities, except one, have declared a climate emergency. And although Bracknell Forest is the exception, it also has a motion on climate change as well. And you can see that there's very much a focus on net zero, this idea about balancing out the emissions that are produced, but making sure that we don't produce any more than is taken out of the system. So we get to that net zero, and we can do that with mitigation strategies, We can do that with carbon capture and storage, and we can also do that with offsetting. There is a semantic difference, I would suggest, between carbon neutral and net zero. Sometimes those two terms do tend to get conflated, but I think if we're focusing on net zero, then the offsetting tends to be much less than it would be otherwise in a carbon neutral world. And of course, if we offset, we've got to make sure that that goes into local projects and areas where the local authority has some degree of leverage. And you can see from the same slide that across the Berkshire region, carbon emissions have reduced over time. That's got something to do with the fact that we've decarbonised the grid, and so emissions have reduced that way. And it's also got something to do with local action. Of course, there are variations in somewhere like West Berkshire, which is quite a rural community. Then the per capita emissions, and indeed the total emissions, tend to be somewhat higher than they are in more urban areas like Reading. And Reading itself has done quite well. It's reduced its emissions by nearly 50% from 2005 to 2019. But to get to net zero by 2030 requires upping the ante and reducing emissions by 50% again. We've seen new opportunities as well, haven't we, in terms of the impact of COVID. You know, we did things differently. It wasn't always a business as usual scenario during the lockdown. There was a lot of climate positive behaviour. We saw cycling lanes introduced in some cities, an improvement even in terms of air quality, although weather conditions have obviously impacted on that as well. Pedestrianisation became quite a thing in many cities, from Manchester through to Oxford through to Bristol. And we've even started to see arguments for redesigning city economies to make them more like perhaps some of the ideas promulgated by Kate Raworth in her Donut Economy book, which is a great read. And then the idea of the 15-minute city, where everything is close at hand, all your facilities are within walkable distance. Paris is one typical example of how the mayor there, Anne Hidalgo, is taking on board that concept. But of course, climate change and net zero is very messy and fragmented. It's a kind of typical example of a multi-level governance issue. So we have the UK government involved, and of course the devolved constituents also play a role, and then the regional level of government is also really important, as well as local government, and of course the local councils themselves. So finding ways of making those different layers of government work together so that we do fulfill that really important target within our local authorities is so vital. And of course, local authorities themselves have a big role to play. They can influence the situation in terms of reducing emissions by looking at their own estate and making that much more energy efficient. They can promote active mobility, for example, procurement through green supply chains as well, tree planting, improved waste management, and of course through the planning system. Here in Reading, the local plan now makes it a requirement that all new housing of more than 10 units should be zero carbon. So there's quite a degree of influence, although of course the constraints of austerity and even the lockdown itself have put local authorities in our area under some degree of strain. But we as individuals, on a positive note, which is really what I wanted to get across in my short presentation today, we can all make a difference. You know, we can take the pledge in Reading. You can log on to the Arcan website and look at the kind of things that we can all do. Many of you will be familiar with how we can change our daily lives, but it's spreading that message, using less heat and turning down and switching off, even turning off your video camera during a Zoom or a MS Teams meeting can reduce your carbon emissions, taking a shower instead of a bath, and all the other things that we can do as individuals collectively. All of that adds up and we can start to make a real difference. And we can make a difference at community level as well. We have the Reading Hydro scheme as well, which is very successful, has received a lot of publicity recently. We have the Reading Community Energy Scheme, which people like Dan Furbank and Tony Cowling there have also been involved in. And not only in Reading itself, but in the wider context of West Berkshire, we have the UK's first community municipal investment scheme, which was a kind of share offer for people to buy into investing in an investment which then led to funding of renewable projects and other LED lighting, cycling routes and environmental investments. Something like £1 million was raised from 600 investors, which is a fifth of the local area of people within that group, that they were from the local area. So it's been quite a successful scheme, as has the Reading Community Energy Scheme. So some really good examples emerging of community active involvement in energy and green finance. And then, as far as myself and my colleagues are concerned, just to highlight that we've been involved in 3 different projects. The Reading 2050 project, which is ongoing, so that looks at how Reading can become smart and sustainable by 2050, and that has become embedded in the local plan for Reading Borough Council. We've also been involved in a £4.75 million funded project, which looks at the Thames Valley as a kind of live lab. And the nice thing about that one is it involves all the unitary authorities across Reading. So colleagues from the School of the Built Environment, Phil Coker, Stephen Smith and Vincent Lowe, as well as our postgraduate researchers, Saru, Fazane and Saeed, have all been helping on the air quality and energy themes. We've been measuring air quality from an improved deployment of air sensors, which has thrown up some interesting findings around the impact of COVID on air quality in Reading. And my colleagues in the energy stream have been working on how you can develop a smart platform for improving energy efficiency at local authority level, but also playing an important role in thinking about how EV infrastructure could be rolled out within these different local authorities. And then finally, I've also been involved in the Reading Climate Change Partnership, which I was going to just highlight some of the activities that we've been involved in. So as you can see, we were formed in 2007. We're a multi-stakeholder partnership. We're all volunteers, actually. We've grown the board over the last few years to include a member of Reading Youth Parliament, but we've also got business representatives, people from education, people from local authorities and volunteer groups. So it's a very diverse group. We're funded through the solar feed-in tariff, and we're hosted by Reading Borough Council. The distinction between the partnership board, which I sit on and I co-chair with Tracy Rawling Church, who's based in Aclaro Advisory in Wokingham, is that the partnership is the board and it's the kind of decision-making structure that works with the Borough Council to develop the strategy, but then our Reading Climate Action Network, as it's known as, is all our great bunch of volunteers across Reading who are spreading the word and developing this activism. It does link with the Reading 2050 vision as well, in terms of a smart and sustainable Reading, but of course our focus here in the partnership is very much on 2030, and it's all about making Reading a climate resilient town, resilient to the impacts of climate change. So adaptation is really important. We have the beginnings of an adaptation plan as well, that's part of our strategy, but moving towards that net zero target by 2030. And really, if you live, work or study in Reading, then do take a look at our website, and I hope you find it interesting. It's a complex picture. There's a lot of challenges involved. We're doing pretty well at the moment, but we're not complacent. You know, we're focusing on transport, reducing traffic and the need to travel is really important, promoting walking, cycling, all of these things, as well as retrofitting. Reading has a lot of terraced housing, something like 42% of our housing in Reading is terraced, so that provides a big challenge, and a lot of that housing stock is pre-19. So there's some big issues, not only about decarbonising energy systems and making sure that you have the right kind of heating in those homes, but also making those homes more energy efficient as well. And of course, renewable energy is a big focus, as we saw from that one example of the community energy scheme. Buying less stuff, we can all do that. A real focus on a circular economy in Reading with some really important input from not only colleagues in the university, but also people across Reading, working with our theme leads to help tackle these important issues. And then finally, last but by no means least, nature-based solutions as well, which are really important in terms of green space, rewilding and all the other things that we do. And of course, in listening to Dan Fernback last week, it was great to hear what the university is doing in that respect. And the university itself, as I said earlier, is a very important partner in this partnership. So there we are. That's the website if you want to take a look. We have a current blog series which is happening every day and has been talking about COP26, so you might be interested in looking at that. And we had the Climate Change Festival just recently. Okay, moving towards the end now, because I think my time is coming up to a close in terms of questions and so on. But because today is City, Regions and Built Environment Day, there are still some things that are still emerging which are relevant to the kind of role of local authorities, but also the wider built environment. It's been good to hear this morning, for example, that something like £27.5 million worth of UK government funding is actually going to countries in Africa, Asia and Latin America as part of the Urban Climate Action Programme. So at least that's a start, and that will pay for low emission transport in those countries. And I suppose I was intrigued also to see that the Local Government Association just published a poll this morning which suggested that actually of 1,000 people that were surveyed in the UK, something like 40% of UK residents trusted their council to act on climate change, but only 28% trusted national government, and only 15% trusted their world leaders. So that does say something about the nature of governance structures and the relationship that people feel towards their local councillors and their local representatives. And maybe that reinforces this idea, which has been around a long time now, about thinking globally but acting locally. And I think that's a really important message to bear in mind. And so the focus very much, I think, as we emerge from the COP sessions over these last few days, is that it is very much now a focus on near-term action. It's bending the curve by 2030 to make sure we can keep within that 1.5 degree limit over pre-industrial levels. Of course, these are challenging targets, aren't they? You know, net zero by 2030 is a huge challenge, and maybe there is actually a need to legislate for net zero in local plans, so it becomes a statutory duty for local authorities in the UK to focus on that issue. And I think we've got to remember as well, it's not just about the target in itself, it's about how you get there, and it's about ensuring a just transition for everybody involved, so that you don't polarize communities and you make sure that those jobs within the economy that might be displaced are provided with jobs that are the result of greening the economy. Some people have talked about as well, and I think it's a point that is a strong one, that central government and local government need to work together much more. So there needs to be some kind of a forum or a framework that brings those elements of government and governance together. And of course, retrofitting is an expensive job at city scale. I've been involved in several Research Council funded projects that have looked at that issue, and it's this idea of scaling up. How can we do that? Can we do that at city level? It's a big challenge. There could be a role here for the new UK Infrastructure Bank. There certainly needs to be some thought given to the tax regime in perhaps improving the benefits of retrofitting vis-a-vis new build, because there's still VAT on retrofit, certain kinds of retrofit, but zero on new build housing. And one of the deficiencies that I think there's been with the UK net zero strategy is that we haven't seen a detailed action plan or roadmap that maps out the stages at each part of that progress towards the target of net zero over not only to 2030, but to 2050 as well. So in summing up, I was very struck by Greta Thunberg's book that No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference. It is up to us as individuals. It's bringing together this idea of raising awareness. Education is so important, but being an advocate for actions against climate change. It's through our individual actions and our collective actions that we can really make a difference. And you know, this idea about thinking locally, thinking globally but acting locally, we can make a difference before it's too late. This extremely harrowing picture of children making their way to school on the other side of the globe in Java and Indonesia because their road has been disrupted by flooding caused by rising sea levels. It's really important that we in the global north do try to make a difference before it is too late, and we've still got time to do that. Thank you for listening. That is, I'm afraid, a bit of a plug for a new book that I've been involved in, but you might be interested, and if you are, those are the details. Thank you.